Hey guys, tonight, let's do something strange. Let's go back to a time where people were afraid of fresh air. Bread was harder than your morals, and doctors thought sneezing too enthusiastically could unbalance your soul. Welcome to Europe Pre-Plague Edition. It's filthy, it's fascinating, and yes, it's slightly funny when you're not actually living in it. So if you like your history dark, your humor dry, and your bedtime stories slightly disease adjacent, hit that subscribe button, get cozy, and prepare to feel better about your own life. Because whatever your day was like, at least you didn't wake up next to a pig on a straw mattress while your neighbor emptied a bucket of poo into the alley. Let's begin. A medieval morning doesn't begin with birdsong or sunshine. It begins with a cold draft, a snort from the pig in the corner, and the sharp realization that the roof leaked again last night. Your mattress is straw, your blanket is your other tunic, and your dreams were short because your neighbor's goat wouldn't shut up. The air smells of smoke, manure, and people. Not just your people, everyone's. There's no privacy in a village of 60 souls, half of whom think washing attracts disease, and the other half can't afford water that isn't shared with the livestock. You wake up sore, stiff, and immediately busy. Nobody rests. Rest is for the dead. You pull on your only dry tunic. There's a tear near the hem you meant to mend last autumn. Too late now. Your feet find your boots still wet, and you step out into the glorious sound of squelching mud. It's always mud. Mud in spring, dust in summer, frozen mud in winter, and a thick, treacherous slop in between. It gets into everything. You've stopped trying to get it out. Breakfast, if there is any, is yesterday's bread and ale. You chew quietly, because speaking wastes energy, and you need every scrap of strength to drag your body through another day of ploughing, lifting, mending, and apologizing to your back. If you're lucky, someone remembered to skim the mold off the cheese. If not, it's protein. Either way, you swallow and move on. The fields don't plough themselves, and neither do the taxes. Every 10th sheaf goes to the church, and the rest to the Lord who owns the land, your house, and technically your bones. You rent your life from him, paid in labor, loyalty, and a carefully cultivated habit of not complaining. If your crop fails, you still owe him. If the weather ruins the harvest, you still owe him. If your child dies of fever and you can't finish the work well, someone else will, probably your neighbor or your widow. There's a rhythm to it all. Sun up, work. Sun down, stop. On Sundays, you go to Mass and thank God you're not in hell. Yet, the priest says sin surrounds you, and you nod because you're sure he's right. Though you're not exactly sure what you've done, you confess anyway, because the idea of purgatory is worse than rain in February. And that's saying something. Your world is small. You've never left your village. The nearest town is 2 days' walk, and you have neither the shoes nor the time. News comes by rumor, carried by a peddler who sells pins, ribbons, and improbable stories of cities where people live in stone towers and eat meat on weekdays. You listen with interest, nod politely, and forget everything by supper. Illness is part of life. Children die young. Mothers die in childbirth. Coughs turn into wheezing. Wheezing turns into silence. You don't question it. You bury. You mourn. You move on. When someone falls sick, the local wise woman arrives with herbs, whispers, and strong-smelling ointments. The priest comes too, just in case it's demons. Between them, they cover all the bases. Sometimes people recover. Often they don't. The noblemen, the ones with gloves and swords and horses named after saints, live a different life entirely. You see them from a distance, shiny, tall, and inexplicably clean. They ride through the village twice a year, checking accounts and reminding you, with firm smiles, that loyalty is its own reward. You bow low, Don't speak unless spoken to, and hope they don't need a new squire. Trade is slow, uncertain, and mostly irrelevant. You grow what you eat, you mend what you wear. You know the seasons not by calendar, but by what rots, what blooms. And when the sheep start looking nervous, you fear frost, drought, fire, and taxes in that order. War is something that happens far away, until it doesn't, and then you hide in the woods. Entertainment consists of stories, songs, and watching someone fall into a ditch. On feast days, the church allows dancing. You spin in circles, drink something vaguely alcoholic, and try not to break your ankle on a tree root. That's joy. It lasts until someone starts coughing again. You believe in God. Everyone does. You also believe in curses, fairies, saints, relics, dreams, and the strange power of the full moon. You carry charms, avoid crossroads at night, and knock 3 times before entering certain rooms. Not because you're foolish, but because your grandmother did, and she lived to 38, which is practically ancient. And then there's the cold. It seeps into your bones, lives behind your eyes, and refuses to leave until May. You pile furs, straw, people anything for warmth. You sleep close, you breathe the same air, you catch the same sickness, and still, you rise the next day, because there's work to do, because if you don't, no one will. This is life, before the plague, before the coughing turned black, before entire households vanished, before fire carts and mass graves and prayers whispered over streets full of silence. This is the world as it was muddy, painful, small, and full of a kind of brutal hope. It wasn't perfect, but at least it made sense. Yet not every European lived in a thatched hut or squelched through ankle-deep muck each morning, for the fortunate or cunning or ruthless urban life offered a different cadence. Cities like Florence, Bruges, and Paris pulsed with the beginnings of commerce, artisan guilds, and an emerging class of people who neither tilled the land nor served a feudal lord, but instead dealt in cloth, metal, and influence. Let's talk about the merchant. Not nobility, not peasantry. Somewhere in between, their fingers stained with ink and coin rather than dirt. They walked with the confidence of people who could read contracts and count their own money. In Venice, they bought spices. In Ghent, they sold wool. They helped fund cathedrals, not out of piety, but prestige. Urban architecture was practical and aspirational. Lower floors were shops or workshops. Upper levels housed families of 5 to 10, occasionally more if apprentices were included. Houses leaned toward each other, upper stories nearly kissing across alleys. Fire was a constant fear. It was why curfews existed, to ensure hearths were banked by nightfall. Apprenticeships shaped the path to independence. A boy of 10 might leave home to live with a master craftsman, working long hours in exchange for food, training, and eventual admission to the guild. These associations weren't just economic, but deeply social and political. They regulated skill, protected secrets of trade, and negotiated with rulers as collectives. Education, limited as it was, concentrated in cathedral schools or universities. Latin was the language of learning and law. Very few could read it fluently, but literacy was growing among the clergy, among wealthy merchants, among some noblewomen. Manuscripts were copied by hand, illuminated with care, stored under lock and key. Meanwhile, the church loomed over everything physically, economically, ideologically. Bishops ruled with near-princely authority. Cathedrals dominated skylines. Tithes were collected with unblinking regularity. Saints served as heavenly patrons for professions and cities. Relics drove pilgrimages and trade. Religion was not private, it was public and performative. In the legal sphere, justice in towns was more codified than in rural courts. Town charters laid out rights and penalties. Punishments were public stocks, pillories, even execution in central squares. But laws protected certain freedoms too. Some towns could elect their own leaders, levy local tolls, or regulate markets. Urban autonomy was budding. Medical practice, though primitive, was a recognized profession. Barber surgeons offered bloodletting and tooth pulling. Physicians quoted Galen and treated imbalance of humors. Apothecaries sold dried herbs and exotic powders. Midwives handled births and burials with equal routine. Disease was blamed on bad air, bad spirits, or divine displeasure, sometimes all three. Food reflected class as much as region. Bread was universal, but its quality varied from dark rye for the poor to fine white loaves for the elite. Meat was rare for commoners, but salted and spiced in noble kitchens. Lent meant fish. Feast days justified indulgence. Wine and ale flowed freely, and water was avoided whenever possible. But for all their complexity, these urban societies were fragile. Drought, flood, or blockade could collapse supply chains. Fire could raze whole quarters. Riots could erupt over bread prices or bad grain. And epidemics, always feared, could pass along trade routes and end what took generations to build. This was Europe before the Black Death stratified, devout, slowly shifting, a world of rigid roles and rare exceptions. A society deeply unequal, yet deeply interconnected. A house of cards, beautiful in structure, brittle in reality. And soon, the wind would blow. Yet not every European lived in a thatched hut or squelched through ankle-deep muck each morning. For the fortunate or cunning or ruthless urban life offered a different cadence. Cities like Florence, Bruges, and Paris pulsed with the beginnings of commerce, artisan guilds, and an emerging class of people who neither tilled the land nor served a feudal lord, but instead dealt in cloth, metal, and influence. Let's talk about the merchant, not nobility, not peasantry. Somewhere in between, their fingers stained with ink and coin rather than dirt. They walked with the confidence of people who could read contracts and count their own money. In Venice, they bought spices. In Ghent, they sold wool. They helped fund cathedrals not out of piety, but prestige. Urban architecture was practical and aspirational. Lower floors were shops or workshops. Upper levels housed families of 5 to 10, occasionally more if apprentices were included. Houses leaned toward each other, upper stories nearly kissing across alleys. Fire was a constant fear. It was why curfews existed, to ensure hearths were banked by nightfall. Apprenticeship shaped the path to independence. A boy of 10 might leave home to live with a master craftsman, working long hours in exchange for food, training, and eventual admission to the guild. These associations weren't just economic but deeply social and political. They regulated skill, protected secrets of trade, and negotiated with rulers as collectives. Education, limited as it was, concentrated in cathedral schools or universities. Latin was the language of learning and law. Very few could read it fluently, but literacy was growing among the clergy, among wealthy merchants, among some noblewomen. Manuscripts were copied by hand, illuminated with care, stored under lock and key. Meanwhile, the church loomed over everything physically, economically, ideologically. Bishops ruled with near-princely authority. Cathedrals dominated skylines. Tithes were collected with unblinking regularity. Saints served as heavenly patrons for professions and cities. Relics drove pilgrimages and trade. Religion was not private, it was public and performative. In the legal sphere, justice in towns was more codified than in rural courts. Town charters laid out rights and penalties. Punishments were public stocks, pillories, even execution in central squares. But laws protected certain freedoms too. Some towns could elect their own leaders, levy local tolls, or regulate markets. Urban autonomy was budding. Medical practice, though primitive, was a recognized profession. Barber surgeons offered bloodletting and tooth pulling. Physicians quoted Galen and treated imbalance of humours. Apothecaries sold dried herbs and exotic powders. Midwives handled births and burials with equal routine. Disease was blamed on bad air, bad spirits, or divine displeasure, sometimes all three. Food reflected class as much as region. Bread was universal, but its quality varied from dark rye for the poor to fine white loaves for the elite. Meat was rare for commoners, but salted and spiced in noble kitchens. Lent meant fish. Feast days justified indulgence. Wine and ale flowed freely, and water was avoided whenever possible. But for all their complexity, these urban societies were fragile. Drought, flood, or blockade could collapse supply chains. Fire could raze whole quarters. Riots could erupt over bread prices or bad grain. And epidemics always feared could pass along trade routes and end what took generations to build. This was Europe before the Black Death stratified, devout, slowly shifting. A world of rigid roles and rare exceptions. A society deeply unequal yet deeply interconnected. A house of cards, beautiful in structure, brittle in reality. And soon, the wind would blow. Yet not every European lived in a thatched hut or squelched through ankle-deep muck each morning. For the fortunate or cunning or ruthless, urban life offered a different cadence. Cities like Florence, Bruges, and Paris pulsed with the beginnings of commerce, artisan guilds, and an emerging class of people who neither tilled the land nor served a feudal lord, but instead dealt in cloth, metal, and influence. Let's talk about the merchant. Not nobility, not peasantry, somewhere in between, their fingers stained with ink and coin rather than dirt. They walked with the confidence of people who could read contracts and count their own money. In Venice, they bought spices. In Ghent, they sold wool. They helped fund cathedrals not out of piety, but prestige. Urban architecture was practical and aspirational. Lower floors were shops or workshops. Upper levels housed families of 5 to 10, occasionally more if apprentices were included. Houses leaned toward each other, upper stories nearly kissing across alleys. Fire was a constant fear. It was why curfews existed to ensure hearths were banked by nightfall. Apprenticeship shaped the path to independence. A boy of 10 might leave home to live with a master craftsman, working long hours in exchange for food, training, and eventual admission to the guild. These associations weren't just economic, but deeply social and political. They regulated skill, protected secrets of trade, and negotiated with rulers as collectives. Education, limited as it was, concentrated in cathedral schools or universities. Latin was the language of learning and law. Very few could read it fluently. But literacy was growing among the clergy, among wealthy merchants, among some noble women. Manuscripts were copied by hand, illuminated with care, stored under lock and key. Meanwhile, the church loomed over everything physically, economically, ideologically. Bishops ruled with near princely authority. Cathedrals dominated skylines. Tithes were collected with unblinking regularity. Saints served as heavenly patrons for professions and cities. Relics drove pilgrimages and trade. Religion was not private. It was public and performative. In the legal sphere, justice in towns was more codified than in rural courts. Town charters laid out rights and penalties. Punishments were public stocks, pillories, even execution in central squares. But laws protected certain freedoms too. Some towns could elect their own leaders, levy local tolls, or regulate markets. Urban autonomy was budding. Medical practice, though primitive, was a recognized profession. Barber surgeons offered bloodletting and tooth pulling. Physicians quoted Galen and treated imbalance of humours. Apothecaries sold dried herbs and exotic powders. Midwives handled births and burials with equal routine. Disease was blamed on bad air, bad spirits, or divine displeasure. Sometimes all three. Food reflected class as much as region. Bread was universal, but its quality varied, from dark rye for the poor to fine white loaves for the elite. Meat was rare for commoners, but salted and spiced in noble kitchens. Lent meant fish. Feast days justified indulgence. Wine and ale flowed freely, and water was avoided whenever possible. But for all their complexity, these urban societies were fragile. Drought, flood, or blockade could collapse supply chains. Fire could raze whole quarters. Riots could erupt over bread prices or bad grain. And epidemics always feared could pass along trade routes and end what took generations to build. Art, too, began to shift. Though still deeply religious, urban patronage allowed for more varied expressions. Walls in wealthy homes were painted with saints and sometimes surprisingly secular scenes. Poetry and song were shared orally, but minstrels and court entertainers added colour and perspective to city life. Music drifted from churches and squares alike. Gender roles, while rigid, were slightly more fluid in cities. Widows could inherit businesses. Women worked in textiles, markets, inns. Some even acted as midwives, healers, or brewmasters. Life expectancy remained short, but cities offered more visibility, even if not more equality. Festivals punctuated the year. The liturgical calendar defined rhythms: Advent, Lent, Easter, Pentecost. But each town added its own flavour: saints' days, harvest fairs, processions, mock battles, fire rituals. These moments weren't just for celebration, they reinforced identity. A city's pride was on display banners, relics, choirs, and ale. And through it all movement. Migration from countryside to city. Artisans from one region to another. Pilgrims en route to Santiago, Rome, Canterbury. Cities were crossroads of trade, of ideas, of contagion. They breathed in people and exhaled change. This was the world before the storm. No one called it the Middle Ages yet. They called it life, and it was about to change. Across Europe, each region carried its own flavour of medieval life. In the south, the cities of Italy flourished with the early bloom of Renaissance, thinking though the term would come much later. In Florence and Siena, banking families like the Bardi and Peruzzi shaped international finance. Their letters of credit crossed borders faster than armies, and their patrons filled churches with frescoes that turned scripture into visual spectacle. In northern towns, Ghent, Bruges, and Cologne trade guilds grew increasingly powerful. Textile production became a pillar of local economies. Flemish weavers, highly skilled and jealously guarded by law, produced wool cloth coveted across the continent. Markets thrived with fabrics, spices, metals, and indulgences all taxed, all counted, all prayed over. In Paris, the Sorbonne attracted scholars from across Europe. Students debated logic, theology, medicine, most in Latin, some in heated whispers after curfew. The city bustled with priests, beggars, merchants, and royal messengers. Every alley echoed with ambition. Further east, towns like Krakow and Prague expanded under the rule of kings, eager to adopt Western customs while preserving Slavic roots. Cathedrals rose, laws codified, Latin blended with vernacular. The Holy Roman Empire, vast and fractious, held it all together barely by threads of allegiance and the papal calendar. In England, London's streets teemed with the scent of tallow and tar. The River Thames served as trade route and sewer alike. Markets rang with the calls of fishmongers and fletchers. Apprentices jostled in alleys, while nobles in Westminster plotted taxes and succession. Across the Channel, French towns saw the tension of centralised monarchy play out. The king's tax agents faced resentment. Their presence, a reminder that even local prosperity served distant crowns. Burgundy, Normandy, and Aquitaine each retained identities that made unity more aspiration than reality. Meanwhile, the countryside fed it all. Villages sent grain, cheese, meat, and wool into towns. In return, they received salt, iron tools, candles, and, on rare occasions, news. Roads were rough, travel slow, but the web connecting town and field thickened each year. In Scandinavia, harsh climate shaped resilience. Coastal towns relied on herring fisheries and timber. Inland farms scratched sustenance from stubborn soil. Norse traditions blended with Christian faith, forming a culture both devout and deeply tied to ancestral memory. The Iberian Peninsula was marked by contrast. Al-Andalus in the south retained its Islamic identity, rich in scholarship, science, and architecture. Cordoba and Granada boasted libraries that dwarfed those in Christendom. To the north, Christian kingdoms expanded, trading battle for land in the long Reconquista. In cities like Toledo, Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived side by side, sometimes in peace, often in unease. Everywhere, faith was the constant. Church bells ordered time, monasteries guarded knowledge. Pilgrims wandered to shrines, seeking healing, forgiveness, or purpose. Saints' relics travelled with bishops, nobles, and crusaders alike. Even the skeptical rarely spoke against the church, not aloud. But not all spirituality belonged to Rome. Folk religion remained potent. Superstitions thrived. Charms against elves or the evil eye hung in doorways. Herbs were gathered by moonlight. Some women, midwives and healers, walked a line between revered and feared. Children rarely attended school. Most worked herding, hauling, helping. Their games involved sticks, stones, and imagination. Mortality hovered over them. 1 in 3 would not reach adulthood. Those who did bore scars, physical and emotional, of a world without guarantees. Marriage was early, especially among peasants. Dowries mattered. So did land. Consent, while preached by the church, often came after negotiation between families. Love could bloom later, or not. Survival was often partnership enough. And above it all, the sky, unlit by modern glare, it told time and forecast weather. The moon governed tides and moods. Comets brought dread, eclipses, awe. The heavens were both calendar and warning, read by astrologers and priests alike. By the early 1300s, the climate had begun to change. Subtly, then starkly. Colder winters, wetter springs. The little ice age was creeping in. Crops failed. Harvests grew thin. Famine loomed, and between 1315 and 1317, much of northern Europe starved. The Great Famine claimed hundreds of thousands. That hunger left scars. The poor became poorer. Landowners demanded more. Some blamed sin. Others blamed Jews. Social trust thinned like soup in Lent. When food returned, gratitude did too, but it had an edge. A sense that the world had shifted, and beneath it all, trade still pulsed. Venice grew rich, Genoa ambitious. The Silk Road connected Europe to Mongol Asia. Caravans crossed deserts. Ships hugged coasts. Gold, slaves, silk, pepper, all moved. And so did things far smaller. Things no one could see. Fleas, rats, germs, portents. Europe was not doomed. Not yet. But the stage was set. In the shadow of cathedrals and castles, a subtler rhythm shaped daily life, the turning of the agricultural calendar. Even in cities, the echo of the land was never far. Markets pulsed with the ebb and flow of harvests. Festivals mapped the seasons, and most still depended on fields they did not own for food they could barely afford. The seasons were not quaint, they were a constant negotiation with survival. Spring brought hope and ploughing. Summer brought sweat and weeding. Autumn brought anxiety and reaping. And winter brought prayers. Always prayers. In villages, the planting of rye or barley was often accompanied by ritual, a sprinkle of holy water, a whispered charm, a glance skyward. The line between divine blessing and practical tradition blurred. Tools were passed down like relics. Oxen were named not out of affection, but superstition. A field ploughed with the same beast year after year was thought to grow more obedient crops. Livestock, too, bore the brunt of this uncertain world. Pigs were prized not only for meat, but for their ability to eat nearly anything. Chickens were currency. Cows, if owned, were wealth on 4 legs. Their milk was nutrition, trade, and status. In lean years, eating your cow was the end of hope. You never ate your last cow. You starved beside it. For women, life was work wrapped in duty. From morning till night, they spun, baked, gathered, birthed, bandaged, and buried. Elite women managed estates, negotiated marriages, embroidered piety into tapestries. Peasant women hauled water, scrubbed pots, fetched dung, and whispered songs to babies while kneading bread. Daughters learned by watching. There were no manuals. Skills passed mouth to hand to shoulder. Hands told the history books did not. In towns, prostitution was both condemned and tolerated. Brothels were taxed, sometimes even licensed by civic authorities. The church thundered against them, but towns quietly counted the revenue. Moral duplicity was not new. It was simply medieval. Death, meanwhile, was no stranger. Even before the plague, death was a dinner guest. Fevers stole the young. Childbirth stole the strong. Accidents claimed the unlucky. A slip on ice, a fall from a ladder, a cut gone foul, these were not exceptions. They were Tuesday. And still, life went on. People loved. They sang. They danced. They made rude jokes and drank too much and argued about saints. They hoped for better harvests, for less aching knees. For a year without burial, Europe before the Black Death was not a golden age, but it was a living age. It endured, it adapted, and it believed in God, in luck, in each other. The silence that followed would only make its voice more vivid, and that voice, muffled by centuries, still murmurs in the roots of cities and the corners of fields. This is the world we must remember, because it is the world that was lost. Winter was the cruel tutor of the medieval year. It arrived early, lingered late, and taught through hunger. Fields lay barren, frozen beneath grey skies. The wind knifed through every gap in timber walls. Food stocks dwindled. Rats multiplied. Salted meat grew suspect. Bread hardened to the consistency of stone. In poorer households, stew pots sat on the hearth day and night. Each morning, a new ladle of water was added. Each evening, something vaguely edible was dropped in cabbage leaves. Barley, a bone that had already served twice. Hunger made inventive cooks of everyone. Recipes were oral and mostly cautionary. Clothing was layered, but rarely sufficient. Wool tunics and cloaks could guard against the chill, but shoes leaked, gloves were scarce, and blankets were shared. Families huddled together at night, not out of sentiment, but necessity. Body heat was currency. Stories were passed from mouth to ear beside the fire. Tales of saints, monsters, plagues of the past. Some warned, some soothed, some blurred the line between the two. Children grew up listening, eyes wide in firelight, absorbing a world where the miraculous and the mundane slept side by side. And while the world outside froze, the church remained warm figuratively and literally. Monasteries stockpiled food. Abbeys hosted feasts on holy days. Cathedrals offered light, colour, music, and a vision of eternity etched in stone and glass. For the common folk, stepping inside was stepping into another realm, where God was gold and Latin and incense. Yet even within sacred walls, politics brewed. Bishops contended with abbots, popes with kings, disputes over land, taxes, heresy, councils convened, bulls were issued, excommunications threatened. The faithful watched from the pews, uncertain whether the voice from the pulpit echoed heaven or Rome. Above all, people endured, because they always had, because the soil still turned, the rivers still flowed, and hope, though battered, never vanished. Mothers whispered prayers into cribs. Fathers taught sons how to bind a tool handle. Sisters shared secrets over looms. Life held tight to its thread, and no one, not in the fields, not in the cities, not even in the courts of kings, could imagine how close the knife of fate already lay to the skin of Europe. It would not arrive as war or fire. It would not declare itself. It would arrive quietly, on a breeze, in a flea, beneath the boards of a merchant ship. But for now, in the hush before horror. Europe drew breath. Though winter gripped the land, preparations for spring never ceased. Tools were mended with care. Seeds were inspected and stored. Young oxen were broken to the yoke. Even in famine years, when stores were bare, the ritual of readiness carried on. For to stop was to surrender. And surrender was not in the nature of those who tilled medieval Europe. In abbeys, scribes laboured under flickering lamplight, copying texts letter by letter. Some were Bibles, others legal treatises, herbal manuals, or chronicles of kings. Mistakes were scraped away with blades. Illuminations in the margins depicted saints, demons, and sometimes strange beasts, a dragon with a monk's head, a snail chasing a knight. Not everything in a manuscript was solemn. At sea, sailors navigated with rudimentary charts and ancient instincts. The Mediterranean bustled with trade Italian galleys bound for Alexandria, Catalan merchants trading wool for spices, pilgrims seeking Jerusalem. Ports were hives of diversity. Languages collided. Goods changed hands. So did ideas. So did diseases. Meanwhile, behind castle walls, nobility danced to their own rhythm. Feasts filled great halls with meat, music, and murmurs of alliance. Boar's head glistened on platters. Minstrels sang tales of Roland and Charlemagne. Marriage was strategy. Bloodlines were currency. Even affection bowed to inheritance. Knighthood offered both honour and burden. Boys of noble birth trained from 7 first as pages, then squires. They learned swordplay, horsemanship, heraldry, and Latin prayers. By 21, if deemed worthy, they were dubbed knights, swearing oaths to lords, kings, and sometimes abstract ideals. Chivalry was as much myth as code. Castles, contrary to modern fantasy, were cold, draughty, and smelled of dogs. Their walls were thick for defense, but windows small, and fires often insufficient. Still, they symbolized authority. From the ramparts, lords surveyed their holdings, their villages, and the people bound to them by law, land, and loyalty. Justice among the nobility came through courts and charters. For the poor, it came through custom and punishment. Trial by ordeal still lingered in some corners. Hold hot iron, retrieve a stone from boiling water. If your wounds healed cleanly, God had spoken. If not, so had man. Witchcraft, though not yet a widespread obsession, simmered in suspicion. Wise women were consulted and feared. A cow's illness, a failed birth, a sudden death, all could spark murmurs. The church discouraged folk magic, but rarely pursued it with vigour. That would come later. Feast days marked more than spiritual observance. They were the punctuation of the year. Candlemas, Pentecost, Michaelmas. Days when work paused, markets swelled, minstrels wandered, and even the poorest tasted something sweet. Honey cakes, meat pies, ale poured without measure. For a moment, burdens lifted. Children knew joy too. They carved toys from wood, chased geese, told riddles, and dared each other to knock on the gravedigger's door. Education was rare, but learning still happened in kitchens, in fields, in songs. Rhymes taught measurements, proverbs carried warnings, lullabies bore ancient truths. In every hamlet, stories anchored memory. Oral histories passed from elders to youth. The knight who returned from crusade with one eye. The woman who gave birth to twins during a comet's passing. The cow that refused to be milked on a saint's feast day. Each tale embroidered truth with wonder. The rhythm was imperfect. The days were hard, but they were full, and they were numbered. Beneath the outward rhythms of labor, trade, and prayer, a slower tide was rising in Europe, one of change, not abrupt, not violent, but undeniable. Population had boomed over the last 2 centuries. From the year 1000 to 1300, the number of people across the continent had more than doubled. Forests were cleared, marshes drained, marginal land cultivated. New villages sprang up, market towns grew, fields pushed against the limits of the soil. But the land had limits. The agricultural techniques of the time crop rotation, fallowing, manuring were effective, but crude by modern standards. Grain yields were modest. In a good year, a farmer might harvest 4 times what he planted. In a bad year, barely enough to survive. As populations swelled, the margin for error shrank. 1 poor harvest meant hunger, 2 meant famine. With more mouths than margin, scarcity became a shadow ever at the edge of light. In cities, crowding grew worse. Houses leaned closer, waste piled higher. Wells were dug, but often too close to latrines. Contagion had fertile ground. Still, people came seeking wages, opportunity, or escape. Serfs fled to cities, and if they avoided capture for a year and a day, they became free. So the saying went, city air makes free. Freedom, however, did not mean equality. Even within guilds, hierarchies held. Masters set the rules, journeymen obeyed, apprentices endured. Women were often barred or severely limited. Foreigners paid higher taxes. Minorities, particularly Jews, were tolerated when useful and persecuted when not. In places like Mainz, Paris, or Barcelona, Jewish communities contributed as physicians, merchants, financiers. They spoke multiple languages, kept precise records, and lived under protection of kings or bishops. But this protection was fickle. A loan unpaid, a drought unexplained, a rumor unleashed, and protection turned to pogrom. Despite these tensions, commerce knitted the continent. The Champagne fairs in France drew traders from England, Italy, and the Low Countries. The Hanseatic League linked Baltic cities with German ports. Genoese ships docked in Constantinople. Venetian coins passed through Cairo. Along with goods came knowledge. Arabic numerals, paper, translations of Aristotle and Galen, all filtered into universities and monasteries. The works of Avicenna, Averroes, and Maimonides stirred debate. Old ideas were challenged, tentatively. Yet for all its learning, Europe remained deeply superstitious. Omens were taken seriously. A 2-headed calf, a blood-red moon, a sudden storm during Mass each sparked anxiety. Clerics warned of judgment. Astrologers plotted conjunctions. Peasants lit candles and whispered charms. Still, most lived with hope. A child's birth, a good harvest, a debt repaid. These were victories. A repaired roof, A successful marriage, a meal with meat, all marked prosperity. Faith was not blind, it was necessary. And so the year 1347 dawned like any other. Fields were tilled, ships launched, prayers murmured. Nothing in the air or sky foretold catastrophe. Nothing in the sermons hinted at scale. But already, in the east, a storm was moving west, not of wind or war, but of something too small to see. It would arrive on fur, on flea, on breath, and it would not leave quietly. Messina, October 1347. A ship arrives from the east. The crew is sick. Some are already dead. Boils swell in armpits and groins. Fever burns through the body like wildfire. The ship is turned away. Too late. The plague spreads before orders are given. Rats skitter from ship to shore. Fleas leap unseen. People flee inland, carrying death with them. Venice, Marseille, Pisa, Barcelona. The pattern repeats. A ship docks. The city sickens. By spring of 1348, the plague reaches Paris and London. Physicians argue miasma's planetary alignment, but they are helpless. Priests administer last rites from afar. Mass graves open. Entire households vanish. Markets fall silent. Churches echo with prayers unanswered. Cities try to close their gates. Villages shun strangers. Rumors blame Jews, foreigners, sinners. Violence erupts. Fear rules. Some turn to faith. Flagellants roam, whipping themselves in repentance. Others lose belief. Monasteries are emptied. Priests die in droves. Hope withers. And still the plague spreads. No status offers protection. Kings, peasants, clergy all fall. Symptoms are sudden and grotesque. Buboes swell. Blood fills lungs. Death comes fast. Some die in hours. Others suffer for days. Parents abandon children. Neighbors flee. The dead lie unburied. Bells toll without pause. The streets smell of decay. Life halts, but the rats move on. Ever forward, ever feeding. Europe trembles, and no one, not the learned, not the holy, not the powerful, can stop it. The year 1348 unfolds with unimaginable speed. What once was rumor becomes reality. Across Europe, the disease spreads as though guided by a silent, malevolent hand. Not a village remains untouched. Not a city stands untouched for long. In towns, food stalls are abandoned. The butcher does not open. The baker's hearth grows cold. Trade halts. The streets are too quiet. And then, too loud, filled with the wailing of the grieving and the gasping of the dying. Doctors wear strange masks filled with herbs. The beak-like designs meant to purify the air. But it does not save them. They fall too. Nobles lock themselves away in castles, but the plague rides in on their servants, their letters, their linens. Whole monasteries are wiped out. Monks who once chanted prayers for the world's salvation now lie in rows beneath their own altars. Priests stop ringing bells, not because they are careless, but because they are gone. In Florence, tens of thousands die. In Avignon, so many perish that the Pope consecrates the entire Rhone River so bodies can be dumped in without sin. In London, pits are dug in the night, row upon row, layer upon layer of the anonymous dead. Human bonds begin to fray. Mothers flee from children. Friends stop visiting. Lovers avoid touch. Fear makes strangers of everyone. Yet some turn to joy wild, desperate joy. They drink, feast, sing into the night. For if tomorrow is not promised, let today be extravagant. These are not celebrations, but farewells. Artists begin to sketch skulls into the corners of their paintings. Death dances alongside saints and sinners alike. The dance macabre is born grim, insistent, democratic, and in the countryside, silence reigns. Fields go untended, sheep wander. The wind moves across abandoned land. Birds nest in rafters where children once laughed. Still, the plague does not pause. It moves along rivers, through valleys, over mountains. It rides with merchants, hides in wagons, lingers in churches. It finds the hungry, the devout, the defiant, and in its wake, Europe is not the same. Fields lie fallow, streets emptied, entire lineages snuffed out. The feudal order begins to crack. Labor becomes scarce. Survivors begin to question not just fate, but authority. In the quiet left behind, seeds of a new world are scattered. Yet even as death becomes a common tongue, responses vary. Some cities resist longer isolating early, closing gates, enforcing quarantines. Dubrovnik, for instance, establishes one of the earliest recorded quarantine stations, setting a precedent that echoes centuries forward. Elsewhere, desperation breeds extremes. In Strasbourg, hundreds of Jews are burned alive by mobs who believe the plague is a plot. Pogroms erupt, and entire communities are wiped out not by disease, but by fear wearing the mask of righteousness. Meanwhile, the economy falters. Ships rot at anchor, crops spoil unharvested, coins are buried with their owners, wills are rewritten hastily, if at all. And yet, ironically, those who survive may find themselves suddenly wealthy. Land is cheap, wages rise, labor, once cheap and abundant, now has power. Cemeteries overflow, churches consecrate new ground, mass graves become common. Yet even here, hierarchy clings. Nobles are buried in family vaults, peasants in pits. But under the soil, death knows no difference. Artists, surviving patrons, and chroniclers begin to reflect a new worldview. Manuscripts darken, margins fill with skeletons, hourglasses, and lamentations. Chronicles shift from hagiography to horror. The old order is not dead, but it has been wounded. And somewhere, amid the grief and soot, the roots of change begin to twist. The plague does not merely kill, it reorders, it questions, it breaks the cycle, and it is not done. The waves of the plague ripple outwards still. Even as infection slows in one city, it rises in another. Recovered places fall again. The first blow may be the harshest, but the aftershocks continue for years. And with each resurgence, the social fabric wears thinner. Families who once had 10 children now have 2. Fields meant for wheat become overgrown. Estates fall into ruin. Feudal lords find their manors vacant, their rents unpaid. Some turn violent, reasserting control through law and lash. Others adapt, offering better terms. Land, even wages. The balance has shifted. For the first time in memory, labourers have leverage. Serfs escape to cities. Artisans negotiate pay. Landless peasants find abandoned plots and claim them. It is not revolution, but it is rebellion, silent and slow. Religious life contorts under the strain. Many see the plague as divine punishment. But for what the Church's failure to protect or explain sows doubt. New sects whisper of change. Mystics preach strange visions. In Bohemia and beyond, reform brews. And children, those who survive, grow in a world their parents would not recognize. Their play is quieter, their games, tinged with funerals and masked parades. They grow up among empty houses and cautious adults. The plague has shaped them, and they will shape the future. Even nature responds. Wildlife reclaims abandoned places. Wolves are seen near towns. Forests thicken where they had been cleared. The land, it seems, is healing, though it heals over scars. The Black Death does not end in a single year or even 5. It fades, returns, mutates, but it leaves behind a Europe unmoored, sobered, strangely fertile. In the silence of the dead, something new begins to stir. Not hope, not yet, But motion, and motion in time becomes transformation. And that transformation begins with questions. Why had the church, the keeper of souls and truth, failed to protect them? Why had the nobility fled, barricaded in castles, while the poor perished by the thousands? Why had prayers not worked, relics not saved, fasts not averted? Faith persisted, but it frayed. The infallible began to look very human. In cities, survivors returned to ruins, entire neighborhoods empty, guilds without masters, workshops without apprentices. But the vacuum did not last. New families claimed the spaces. New hands lifted the tools. The economy, bleeding and broken, began to twitch. In the countryside, landlords found themselves short of workers. Fields lay untended. Rents went unpaid. For the first time, peasants could bargain. Wages rose. Contracts were renegotiated. In England, this triggered the Statute of Labourers, an attempt to freeze wages. But laws could not undo death, nor halt change. Women, too, found roles altered. With men dead, widows managed estates, daughters learned trades. Some stepped into roles once barred to them. The old order resisted, but necessity left cracks. And in those cracks, new possibilities bloomed. The plague also left a psychological scar. Art shifted, literature darkened. The dance of death macabre, mocking, inescapable, marched across Europe's imagination. Life was fleeting, uncertain. The vanities of power and wealth, meaningless. Even kings were bones beneath robes. Yet paradoxically, from this horror emerged renewal. Fields, fallow for years, recovered. Forests regrew, cities rebuilt, trade resumed, and with fewer mouths to feed, the survivors lived better. Diets improved, wages climbed. Opportunities, once unthinkable, appeared. In Florence, a generation later, artists like Giotto laid the foundation for the Renaissance. In England, the seeds of rebellion stirred. In France, the monarchy reeled but would reassert. Across Europe, people adapted not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. The Black Death had not just thinned the population, it had shattered the mirror of the medieval world. And as people picked up the pieces, they began to reshape the image. But not all lessons were heeded, not all scars healed, and not all the dead rested. Because in hidden corners, rats still scurried, and in the breath of the living, the plague sometimes still stirred. As the decades passed, the echoes of the Black Death lingered. Survivors carried memories as heavy as any tombstone. Even those born after the worst years heard stories of silent streets, of pitiless winds, of carts groaning with the nameless dead. Memory itself became a kind of inheritance. In many places, the plague returned, not as fierce, not as sudden, but deadly still. Outbreaks flared up sporadically in 1361, 1369, 1375. Each time, it culled a new generation. These recurrences were no longer surprises. They were feared seasons, like winter or war. The church, having lost so many clergy, rushed to train replacements, but wisdom could not be hurried. The result was a clergy often younger, less educated, and in some places, deeply resented. Faith persisted, but it was no longer unquestioned. Lay movements grew. Mystics gained followers. Heresy, once rare, began to spread like wildfire. Governments too were changed. Monarchs faced restive populations. In England, poll taxes and wage controls ignited the peasants' revolt of 1381. In France, the 100 Years' War dragged on against a backdrop of economic strain and social change. Authority no longer felt divine, it felt distant, brittle. In cities, the labour shortage transformed production. Innovations in tools, in management, in finance followed. Guilds adapted, town charters expanded. Women took on roles in crafts, in trade, in bookkeeping. They stitched, brewed, taught, healed. Though the patriarchy stood, its walls now bore hairline cracks. Literature, always a mirror, turned dark. Writers like Boccaccio captured the plague's absurdity and agony in the Decameron. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales hinted at a world where pilgrimage was less about salvation and more about storytelling, companionship, and fleeting pleasures. Humour turned cynical. Morality tales became ambiguous. Even burial changed. The rich once demanded elaborate tombs. Now, modesty crept in. Death was no longer distant. It had touched every shoulder. Images of skeletons, of dancing corpses, adorned walls and manuscripts. Not to terrify, but to remind memento mori. Remember, you must die. Architecture reflected loss. Cathedrals paused, plans scaled down. But in time, rebuilding began this time with different intentions. Hospitals grew in number and purpose. Clean water systems improved in some cities. Public health, still primitive, became a whispered concept. In the east, the Mongol Empire fractured. Trade along the Silk Road slowed. The interconnectedness that had brought prosperity and plague dissolved into caution. Travel continued, but with wariness. Caravanserais that once bustled now echoed with wind. Art, always watching, leaned toward realism. Painters began to depict not only saints but the sick. The divine bled into the mortal. Angels still hovered, but now beside crutches and weeping eyes. The ideal gave way to the observed. The world view shifted. Man was still small, still sinful, but now also central. A quiet humanism stirred beneath robes and behind pulpits. Not a rejection of God, but a re-evaluation of man's place in creation. The gears of Renaissance turned slowly, but their first clicks came in plague's shadow. And as generations passed, people did what they always had. They adapted. They mourned. They hoped. And the silence left by the plague, it became space. Space to grow. Space to imagine. Space to begin again. But beneath the tilled fields, the rebuilt homes, the fresh baptisms, the memory of the Black Death waited, not with malice but with gravity, a reminder that history does not always move forward. Sometimes it buries, and what it buries, it waits to teach again. But for every family that mourned, another began again. Amid the ashes, life stubbornly took root. A new child born, a marriage arranged, a song hummed absent-mindedly as fabric was dyed or bread was kneaded. The mundane acts of survival became sacred. Each gesture, each word, was an assertion we are still here. Land once held by great families was now parceled out. A merchant might buy what a knight had lost. A peasant might rent what once had been beyond dreaming. Status, while still guarded, had softened around the edges. The ladder of class still stood, but some rungs had cracked, and others had been climbed. In Florence, artists spoke of light differently, not just as a divine force, but as something that revealed. Giotto's students played with shadow and skin. In manuscripts, margins teemed not only with saints, but with glimpses of daily life cooking, dancing, sorrow. The sacred no longer floated above. It walked beside. Children born after the first wave grew up in a changed world. They played in graveyards. They learned to read not just prayers, but accounts. They watched their parents rebuild, compromise, and question. And they inherited not just trauma, but resilience. Medicine remained flawed, but inquiry stirred. The plague had humbled certainty. Now, some physicians began to ask harder questions. Dissections, once taboo, became tools. Scholars translated Arabic texts. Universities debated causes, not just cures. It was not yet science as we know it, but it was movement. In port cities, Trade resumed. Ginger, pepper, cloth, tin all flowed again. Ships were watched more closely. Some cities posted guards, built isolation houses. The word quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni. 40 days entered official use. Wisdom bought with blood became policy. Yet plague was not gone. It never truly left. It lingered in rats, in fleas, in breath. It returned in waves. 1361, 1374, 1382, 1399. Sometimes milder, sometimes cruel. Each generation touched by loss. Each city shaped by absence. But with each wave, survival became strategy. Memory became instruction. People washed hands before meals, left shoes at doors, covered mouths when coughing. Simple acts, quiet defenses, passed from mother to child, not as science but as love. And slowly, Europe stood taller, not unscarred, but standing. In this altered landscape, even language began to shift. New words entered the common tongue: pestilence, mortality, contagion. They were spoken with caution, as though names might summon the thing itself. But they also gave voice to grief and to survival. Church sermons now rang with reminders not just of sin, but of impermanence. "Remember you are dust," said the priest, and the people nodded not from fear, but from experience. The words no longer felt metaphorical. They were memories. Pilgrimages increased. Some traveled to give thanks for surviving. Others, to mourn what they'd lost. Shrines grew busy. Roads to Compostela, Canterbury, and Rome bustled again. Each traveller carried with them stories of illness, of loss, of prayers answered or ignored. Stories that stitched one village to the next. And yet, in corners of Europe, skepticism bloomed. Quiet, at first, a question unspoken. Why had the holy died just as the sinful? Why had the relics failed? Why had the prayers not prevailed? These murmurs did not yet topple faith, but they tilted it. Trust bent under weight it could not bear. In royal courts, politics adapted to new realities. Monarchs, who once held distant power, now found it necessary to be visible. Edicts were issued not just with seal and script, but with coin, with relief, with ceremony. A ruler who failed to feed his people risked more than rebellion, he risked irrelevance. Meanwhile, the peasants long accustomed to silence found their voices, not in revolt, not yet, but in negotiation, in demands for shorter hours, for better grain, for the right to move. Lords resisted, of course, but death had taken too many labourers to enforce every law. Where once a man begged for work, now he weighed his options. In England, the landscape of labour transformed. Serfs who once belonged to the land now hired out their hands. Free tenants appeared. In cities, guilds courted journeymen with food, with tools, with promise. The balance was shifting not by decree, but by necessity. This quiet rearrangement touched all classes. Even the nobility sensed it. Marriages now carried new calculations. A rich merchant's daughter might marry a lesser nobleman, bringing dowry and ambition. Lineage alone no longer guaranteed wealth or power. Coins spoke louder than crests. Even fashion changed. With so many gone, wardrobes were inherited, gifted, repurposed. Mourning clothes grew common. Hoods were worn lower, sleeves longer, colours darker. Modesty and sobriety became marks of survival, not just piety. Vanity, once sin, became risk. But not all adjustments were mournful. In taverns, laughter returned, carefully, then freely. A joke about death, a song with new verses. Humour had always been a tool for survival, and now it sharpened. Stories of plague doctors, of foolish nobles hiding in cellars, of priests caught running from their flocks dark, irreverent, oddly healing, children too adapted. Games mimicked what they saw. They played at funerals, at quarantine, at burning herbs in corners. Dolls were wrapped in rags and laid to rest in shoebox graves, innocent, yet echoing. These children grew up marked by a world forever changed, and they carried that change with them. Education resumed in fits. Schools reopened. Monasteries trained scribes anew. But something subtle shifted in what was taught and who was allowed to learn. Practical skills took precedence. Accounting, languages, medicine, even girls, in some towns, were taught to read not as a right, but as a precaution. In art, faces grew more human. Saints had wrinkles. Mary looked tired. Christ bled realistically. Suffering was no longer idealized, it was recognized. Artists painted what they'd seen: carts of bodies, masked doctors, desperate eyes. Beauty was not abandoned, but it shared the canvas with pain. And beneath it all, time pressed forward. The plague did not destroy Europe. It did something stranger. It pruned it, harshly, cruelly. But what remained was alive, aware, adaptable. The old rhythms had been broken, and while some tried to restore them, others began to write new ones. Not all were ready. Some villages vanished entirely. Others clung to old beliefs with tighter fists. But even these held memories now, memories that tempered arrogance, deepened rituals, and, slowly, birthed wisdom. And so, by the late 1300s, Europe stood changed, not healed, not whole, but changed. The plague had burned through body and bone, but also through illusions, and in its wake, the truth stood bare. Life is fragile, but it is also stubborn. It weeps, it falters, it forgets, and then it begins again. In monastery libraries, chroniclers recorded these years not with triumph, but with awe. Anno Domini 1348. One wrote, "When death took 1 in 3, the ink trembled not from fear, but from the effort to make sense of the senseless. The scribes did not seek clarity, they sought memory. That this happened, that we endured. Some called it divine judgment, others, a test, a few, fate. But the most lasting answer was simpler. It was real. The Black Death had come, and nothing had stopped it. And yet, here they were writing again, planting again, praying, doubting, loving again. The map of Europe was no longer the same. Not politically, not yet, but emotionally, socially, spiritually. A generation had watched the sky fall, and now they looked to build something under clearer stars. In cities, councils debated new laws, hygiene, quarantine, public health. Latrines moved away from wells. Markets spaced further apart. In Naples, the dead were buried beyond the walls, in consecrated fields. In Milan, the city had burned houses of the infected brutal, but effective. It became a model, whispered about in letters between mayors. And from the ashes of fear, institutions emerged. Lazaretto's plague hospitals were established. Quarantine became law. Ships from distant ports waited in harbors, watched by officials. Doctors wore emblems of authority, not just mystery. Medicine had failed to prevent the plague, but it had learned. And learning, once kindled, refused to die. The economy shifted too. Artisans rose in influence. Women ran shops alone. Widows claimed property once denied them. Guilds rewrote bylaws. Money flowed differently, less hoarded by aristocrats, more invested in trade. The road to capitalism did not begin here, but it widened here. And slowly, architecture responded. Narrow alleys were redesigned. Squares opened wider. Churches added chapels for the dead. Art spoke of heaven, but with clearer memories of earth. Carvings showed worms, skeletons, time itself devouring kings and peasants alike. Europe had become aware of death. And, strangely, that made it more aware of life. From the north to the south, from the Pyrenees to the Baltic, stories echoed in every dialect of plague carts, of empty villages, of one priest who rang the bell until his fingers bled, of a girl who walked alone across 5 towns to find a living relative. The pain of a continent had turned into narrative, and those narratives, whispered at firesides and woven into tapestries, became a memory Europe would never forget. Not everyone survived, but neither did everyone break. In Florence, they planted flowers in mass graves. In London, a child's drawing of skulls and stars was found centuries later under floorboards. In Krakow, a baker left a note in Latin: "If this passes, be kinder to one another." This, then, was the legacy of the plague, not only destruction, but testimony. A testament to grief, yes, but also to continuity, to the dogged insistence of people who, given every reason to stop, still kept going. And as the bells tolled less often, as spring returned without funeral smoke, as markets crept back and children laughed without flinching, Europe dared to look up. The worst was not forgotten, but it was past. And now, in the space it left behind, something new would begin. The silence after the storm was not peace. It was stunned, hesitant. In some villages, bells no longer rang not out of mourning, but because no one remained to ring them. Fields blossomed with weeds, roads disappeared beneath grass. Birds returned, nesting in rafters of houses that no longer held laughter. Europe had not been destroyed. It had been altered fundamentally, irrevocably. The plague had passed, but its shadow remained. And in that shadow, something unexpected began rebuilding. It started not with kings or councils, but with hands soil-stained, calloused, trembling. The hands of survivors who planted again, hammered again, touched another's face without flinching. Rebuilding was not grand. It was necessary. Entire villages moved. Some places, too haunted by memory or too empty to function, were abandoned. Survivors resettled on higher ground, closer to rivers, nearer to roads. Churches were built anew, not always as grand, but more communal. Foundations were laid over bones, families reformed, widows remarried. Orphans were adopted, often by distant kin, sometimes by no one at all. Bonds formed not just by blood, but by choice out of shared grief, out of mutual need. The idea of family stretched. Land changed hands quickly. So many lords had died that estates fractured. Inheritance laws bent. Women gained property. Younger sons gained titles. Peasants gained opportunity. The rigid social order wavered. Labour was scarce, and for the first time in memory, valuable. Fields that once fed 50 now fed 10. Lords who once scoffed at serfs now offered coin, privileges, even freedom. Some peasants became landowners. Others left the countryside entirely, seeking towns newly desperate for hands. In towns, the change was even more palpable. Guilds, once rigid and exclusionary, relaxed their rules. Apprentices were welcomed earlier. Journeymen demanded and received better pay. Women, who had kept shops running during the plague years, were harder to dismiss. They knew how to price, to barter, to survive. Their presence in markets became normal, then expected. Architecture subtly shifted. Houses were built with more space between them. Windows grew larger. Air, once feared, was now prized. Wells were dug deeper. Streets were paved not just for pride, but for hygiene. The idea of cleanliness, once a luxury, became part of city planning. In many places, Public health emerged as a civic concern. Quarantine stations were formalized. Waste was regulated. Towns hired officials, not priests or nobles, but laypeople to oversee sanitation. What had once been superstition was becoming protocol. Faith, too, was reshaped. The church remained powerful, but it had bled badly. Priests had died in great numbers. Some parishes had no clergy for years. In their absence, lay leaders emerged. Local saints multiplied. Pilgrimage routes shifted. People sought new answers. Mysticism flourished. So did dissent. In England, a preacher named John Wycliffe questioned not only church wealth, but its authority. In Bohemia, Jan Hus would soon echo the same. Heresy became a word used often and feared less. The idea that truth might reside outside Rome took root. Meanwhile, universities reopened. Those who had studied medicine before the plague returned humbled and curious. Anatomy, long restricted by doctrine, gained ground. Observations replaced assumptions. The seeds of a scientific approach, planted in Arab texts and Greek fragments, were now watered by necessity, and art, always a mirror, reflected this shift. Death still haunted canvases, but so did rebirth. Painters began to show not just saints, but citizens, landscapes, laughter, a child learning to walk, a woman lighting a lamp. Beauty emerged, not despite grief, but because of it. Literature also changed. The old epics of chivalry and crusade began to share space with tales of everyday life, of merchants, misers, fools, and lovers. In Florence, a man named Boccaccio wrote, "The Decameron, a story framed by plague, yet filled with wit, humanity, and a quiet defiance against despair. His characters fled the dying city, but they told stories to stay alive." In England, Chaucer would soon do the same, giving voices to pilgrims, not popes. In these pages, humor returned. Irreverence peeked through solemnity. People still believed in God, but they now believed, too, in themselves. This shift was not uniform. Some regions clung tighter to tradition. In Castile and Aragon, church processions grew larger. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, religious festivals turned more elaborate, more fervent. But even here, a quiet change stirred, visible in the margins. In law codes amended, in taxes revised. Population slowly recovered, but it did not rebound as before. Families had fewer children. Marriage came later. Life was measured more cautiously. Death had left a mark too deep to forget quickly. Trade revived, but with new patterns. Genoa lost ground to Venice. Bruges rose, then Antwerp. The Baltic saw a surge in shipping. Port cities learned to inspect vessels, to monitor cargo, to count days of isolation. The rules of commerce now included survival, and in every town, on every square, there remained the memory of absence, a gap where a neighbor had lived, an untended garden, a door that never opened again. Yet even so, people rebuilt. They did not forget, but they dared again, to marry, to plant, to sing. And through this quiet perseverance, a new Europe began to rise, not yet Renaissance, not yet modern, but changed. Legal systems, too, began to evolve under the pressure of post-plague realities. With so many heirs gone, inheritance laws became tangled. Disputes over land and title multiplied. Some courts adapted by accepting testimony from women, once routinely dismissed. Others relied more on written contracts, a shift that accelerated record-keeping and bureaucratic habits. The role of the state expanded not out of ideology, but out of necessity. In places like Milan and Venice, city governments took on duties once managed by guilds or parishes. They regulated prices, food distribution, and even burials. In England, Parliament gained ground as monarchs needed broader support to manage chaos. power redistributed slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Cultural memory cemented these shifts. Songs were sung about the plague years, some mournful, others darkly comic. In stained glass and fresco, skeletons appeared alongside kings and popes. The triumph of death became a visual motif across Europe, a reminder that no crown, no cowl, no coin could stop mortality. Yet, in that very awareness of death, life deepened. Weddings grew simpler but more heartfelt. Feasts became smaller but more frequent. People cherished moments, sun on a wall, a shared loaf of bread, the giggle of a child. And with fewer people, nature breathed easier. Forests regrew, rivers ran clearer, game returned to hunted lands. Some saw this as a divine reset, others as a rare gift in a cruel world. The rebuilding was not grandiose. There were no sweeping revolutions, no proclamations of new orders, but each rebuilt roof, each reopened stall, each child born after the plague was an act of quiet rebellion, a whisper that said we are still here. And in time, those whispers became voices. As towns revived and villages repopulated, the rhythm of life resumed but with a new cadence. The Sunday bell still rang, but its meaning had shifted. Faith endured, but it now lived alongside doubt. Sermons still warned of sin, but they also acknowledged suffering. The church, once unquestioned, now faced quiet scrutiny. In many places, local brotherhoods and lay confraternities grew stronger. These groups cared for the sick, buried the dead, helped orphans. They stepped in where clergy had vanished. Over time, they took on civic roles, organizing processions, funding hospitals, maintaining roads. They embodied a grassroots spirituality, both deeply Christian and surprisingly independent. Education, too, slowly expanded. Where schools had closed, new ones opened, sometimes funded by guilds, sometimes by wealthy survivors hoping to buy grace. Latin still ruled, but vernacular languages began creeping into instruction. Boys of the merchant class learned not just theology, but arithmetic, account-keeping, law. Printing had not yet arrived, but the hunger for knowledge grew. Manuscript copying accelerated, libraries expanded, private collections, once rare, multiplied. Knowledge, once hoarded, began to circulate more freely among the literate classes. And across all these changes drifted a new question, sometimes spoken, often only felt if death could strike without warning. What did life mean? It was not a philosophical debate for scholars alone. It echoed in kitchens, in fields, in markets. A man who had buried 4 children could not be told life was only a test. A woman who had survived as a healer while priests fled did not easily return to silence. People sought meaning. Some returned to old faith with new fervor. Others looked elsewhere into stars, into reason, into self. And so, slowly, unsteadily, the seeds of humanism took root, not in manifestos, but in murals, not in declarations, but in daily acts, a teacher choosing to instruct girls, a mason carving a smiling face into a stone lintel, a widow funding a public fountain with clean water. Each gesture said, we matter, we survive, we build. Economic patterns also realigned. Where once feudal dues dictated the flow of wealth upward, now wages spoke louder. A landowner could no longer expect unquestioned labor. Surviving peasants, aware of their newfound scarcity, negotiated. If one lord refused fair terms, another might offer better. Labor mobility, once restricted by custom, became a quiet force of transformation. Some lords responded with repression. England passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages and bind workers to their manors. But enforcement faltered. The old order depended on numbers that no longer existed. Empty chairs at council tables, vacant stalls in markets, unploughed fields all testified to a truth no law could erase. Urban elites faced similar reckonings. Guilds, struggling to fill their ranks, opened their doors more readily. Women continued to press their claims, not only as widows inheriting shops, but as skilled practitioners in their own right. Not all succeeded, but cracks widened. Tradition became one voice among many, not the only one. Meanwhile, the memory of the plague remained a force in culture. Mystery plays once focused on biblical themes grew darker, more introspective. Pageants of judgment now included everyday figures: the merchant, the maid, the midwife. Death did not only visit kings, it knew the names of commoners. Pilgrimage, too, changed. While some sought healing or indulgence, others travelled to remember. Shrines to plague saints like St. Sebastian and St. Roche multiplied. Their iconography spread arrows and swords, dogs and angels. Churches bearing their names appeared from Flanders to Florence. In households, old superstitions mingled with new practices. Garlic hung next to crucifixes. Prayers were spoken beside herbal brews. Healing charms bore Latin script and folk symbols alike. People did what they could with what they had to guard against a return. The memory of mass death shaped every decision, every belief, every hope, and yet life did not retreat. It adapted. Architecture, too, bore the imprint of the plague. In some places, grand projects were halted, their skeletons left to weather in the sun half-finished cathedrals, towers that reached for heaven and then stopped. But elsewhere, construction resumed with new urgency, not merely to glorify God, but to serve the living. Hospitals were built not only as places for the dying, but for healing and rest. Many bore names like House of Mercy or Home for the Poor Sick. Charity took on structure. Alms were organized. Endowments funded not just monks, but doctors and herbalists. The idea of civic responsibility, once the purview of nobles and bishops, began to shift towards city councils and guilds. The very layout of cities adapted. Narrow alleys were widened in some towns. Wells were relocated. Markets moved to open squares. People spoke more often of cleanliness not just as spiritual purity, but as practical defense. Sanitation, though still primitive, entered public discourse. In some places, walls were extended not for war, but for quarantine. Entire districts were repurposed to house the ill. Isolation became a form of protection, not shame. Public health, though embryonic, had been born. Literacy rose. Survivors left wills, letters, records. Bureaucracies expanded to handle inheritance, property transfer, debt recovery. Clerks were in demand. Scribes worked tirelessly. Paper cheaper than parchment spread. Ink-stained fingers became as common as calloused ones. And across all of this, the human voice grew clearer. Diaries, poems, chronicles. Ordinary people began to speak in writing. Not just monks or nobles, but merchants, midwives, students. They wrote of loss and love, of nightmares and numbness, of the strange quiet after a funeral. The world had suffered together, and it began, in fragments, to remember together, a collective scar, a shared story, still raw, still tender, but no longer hidden. Alongside cultural and civic renewal came intellectual stirrings. In Italy, particularly, survivors began to look backward, not to mourn, but to reclaim. The classical texts of Rome and Greece, preserved in monasteries and Islamic libraries, were dusted off with new reverence. A revival of learning began to bud not in universities alone, but in homes and studios. This would later be called the Renaissance, though no one living in the 1350s would have used the word. What they felt was more like thirst, a craving to understand the human place in a fragile, violent world. not just through dogma, but through reason, through observation, through art. Painters, in the aftermath, turned more fully to the human form, not just saints on golden backgrounds, but real people tired, joyful, grieving, curious, faces with shadows, bodies with weight. Death had made the body impossible to ignore, so they studied it, honored it, captured it in marble and pigment. In philosophy, echoes of ancient Stoicism returned how to endure suffering, how to live well in a world of uncertainty. Writers began to question fate, providence, and power. Boccaccio's Decameron, written amid the pestilence, offered stories not of saints or miracles, but of cleverness, failure, lust, and laughter. It shocked some, it consoled many, and in politics, new questions stirred. If nobles had failed to protect their people, and priests had failed to explain their fate, who, then, had the right to rule? Civic pride sharpened. Local identity grew stronger. In places like Florence, Siena, Lubeck, and Bruges, republics flexed their influence, asserting that community could govern itself. This was not revolution in the modern sense. Thrones remained, crowns glittered, but beneath their shine, foundations trembled. The people had glimpsed a world reordered. They had survived the end of certainty, and now they began to imagine what might come next. Even religion, the oldest scaffolding of European life, began to shift. The church remained powerful, but never again unquestioned. The failure to stop the plague, to protect the innocent, or even to bury the dead with dignity, had left a wound. People still believed in God, but now more personally, less institutionally. Mysticism grew. Individuals reported visions, dreams, moments of divine intimacy. Women, especially, emerged as spiritual voices. Julian of Norwich in England, Catherine of Siena in Italy. They did not speak from pulpits, but their words echoed far. Consolation came not only from ritual, but from interior faith. Simultaneously, heresies multiplied. Groups like the Lollards in England and the Hussites in Bohemia questioned papal authority, indulgences, and the wealth of clergy. These were not atheists, they were reformers, but their questions would one day swell into upheaval. Meanwhile, survivors took a new interest in death itself, not just its fearsome face, but its inevitability, its meaning. Grave art shifted. Tombs featured not only serene effigies, but cadaver monuments, sculpted skeletons, rotting bodies, worms in stone. A warning: this too shall be you. The ars moriendi, the art of dying, emerged as a genre. How to prepare one's soul, how to make peace, how to face the end well. It was not morbid, it was practical. For death had proved itself both common and uninvited. Among the young, a new pragmatism surfaced. They had watched the world collapse. Their education, if any, was interrupted. Their families, reduced. Many grew up fast. Marriage came earlier for some, later for others. Cynicism mingled with resilience. They became the bridge between the old world and the uncertain one, taking shape. And slowly, season by season, laughter returned. Tentative, then full-throated. Carnivals resumed. Songs filled inns. Fairs returned to market towns. Not as if nothing had happened, but because something had. And joy, too, was a form of resistance. Artisans responded to the altered world with innovation. Weavers incorporated new patterns into cloth. Masons carved more expressive figures into stone. Music, once dominated by chant, began to explore harmony and rhythm in bolder ways. A cultural shift born of grief and recovery fueled experimentation. In manuscript margins, playful images danced beside sacred text. Monks drew snails jousting with knights, foxes preaching to geese, skeletons playing instruments. Perhaps it was satire, perhaps coping, perhaps both. The medieval mind, far from simple, understood contradiction. Humor could coexist with horror. Even time itself was reimagined. Towns began investing in mechanical clocks, monumental structures of iron and ingenuity. Bell towers regulated daily life, no longer only by sunlight or the priest's call, but by gears and weights. Time became measurable, trade more punctual, life more structured, and the appetite for knowledge deepened. Universities rebounded, students returned to Paris, Bologna, Oxford, but their questions widened. Medicine, once reliant on Galen and Hippocrates, faced demands for observation and revision. The body had failed in mysterious ways. It must now be studied, not simply moralized. Doctors began to keep case notes. Anatomy texts included sketches. Dissection, though controversial, gained ground. The idea that the body was a map, readable, understandable, began to spread. This seed would take centuries to flower, but the soil was now ready. Cities, in rebuilding, created new institutions. Orphanages multiplied, almshouses expanded. Some towns instituted plague boards groups tasked with monitoring outbreaks, organizing burials, overseeing quarantines. Civic responsibility had acquired both urgency and precedent. The bonds between cities strengthened too. Letters crossed borders, trade resumed, alliances renewed. European identity, though fragmented, grew more conscious. They had suffered together. They would not forget. And across every border, the unspoken question lingered: if death can take everything, what should we make with what remains for those who endured the worst years? Memory itself became a responsibility. Survivors spoke in low tones of the great dying, not just as a chapter in time, but as a rupture in meaning. Chroniclers worked furiously, not only monks, but city scribes, merchants, even women recording names, losses, miracles, and mundane days. Memory was not only for the dead, it was a tool for the living. Town charters were rewritten to account for depopulation. Inheritance laws were adjusted. Tax records showed gaps like broken teeth. Each absence told a story, and those left behind became its keepers. Architecture reflected this as well. In several towns, plague chapels were erected, small sanctuaries built in gratitude by survivors or in memory of entire neighborhoods lost. Statues of saints credited with protection, Roche, Sebastian, Catherine multiplied. Pilgrimages resumed, sometimes redirected to these new local shrines. Miracles were reported with increasing regularity. Some claimed visions, others healings. Many believed that survival itself was divine selection. This belief, though comforting, also fed a growing social divide between those who saw themselves as blessed and those seen as cursed. And yet, a quieter ethic began to spread, not of triumph, but of responsibility. Those who had survived carried with them the knowledge of fragility. The land could fail, the sky could change, the body could betray, but society, when it remembered compassion, could mend. Writers and preachers began to stress mercy, not as weakness, but as wisdom. Town councils offered leniency to returning refugees. Guilds opened apprenticeships for plague orphans. In some rare cases, even serfs were granted plots, small, hard-won freedoms in a world that had momentarily lost its grip. What emerged was not utopia, but it was something different from what had come before. And though few recognized it yet, Europe had begun to turn toward a new age, one not born of conquest or decree, but of survival. The final echoes of the first plague wave left behind more than loss. They left questions, and in some places, the beginnings of answers. What is the value of a life when so many are gone? What should society protect when it knows it can fail? What must be remembered, and what must be let go across the continent? Rebuilding took many forms. In some villages, It meant simply clearing rubble, blessing wells, and planting again. In cities, it meant rethinking trade, hygiene, and law. In churches, it meant quieter liturgies, smaller choirs, candles lit for priests who never returned. But in the minds of poets, artists, scholars, and merchants, it meant reimagining what Europe could become. Slowly, this gave rise to what historians now call the long 15th century, an age of recovery and tension, reform and reaction, shadowed always by the memory of death, but alive with possibility. Florence would nurture the early Renaissance. Prague would birth theological dissent. Bruges would finance new ventures. Seville would reach toward the Atlantic. Wittenberg, eventually, would crack the religious order wide open. But all of this came after the bells, after the silence, after the mass graves and the empty cradles. For now, as the 14th century drew to its uncertain close, Europe stood not triumphant, but changed, weakened in numbers, but widened in perspective, more suspicious of old powers, more conscious of its shared fate. The continent still bore scars, but in them, seeds had been planted. Not all would flourish. Some would rot. Others be forgotten. But the soil had shifted, and in that turning earth, a new world waited to be born. Even in places where recovery was slow, the psychological shift was profound. For centuries, the Church had stood as the ultimate authority on life, death, and what lay beyond. But the plague had revealed cracks in that authority. Prayers had not stopped the dying. Holy relics had not protected towns. The righteous had perished alongside the wicked. Faith did not disappear, but it changed. Lay movements grew groups of common people who sought a more personal, emotional connection to God. The flagellants, though later condemned, were one early sign. The Lollards in England, the Hussites in Bohemia, these were not yet reformers in the modern sense, but they carried seeds of future revolutions. Meanwhile, the idea of charity shifted. Before the plague, giving alms had been about salvation, earning merit for the soul. After, it became also a civic duty. Hospitals were expanded. Leper houses adapted to new roles. Wealthy patrons endowed chapels, schools, and orphanages not merely out of fear for the afterlife, but from recognition of shared vulnerability. And knowledge, ever slow to move, began to stir more quickly. Universities revised medical curriculums. Astronomical theories were challenged, if only quietly. The beginnings of empirical observation, what would one day become. Science found space between theology and tradition. Printing had not yet arrived, but manuscripts multiplied. Scribes were in high demand, and the nature of what they copied began to broaden not just religious texts, but herbal guides, medical treatises, even tales from travelers who had seen the East and lived to tell it. Among the merchant class, global thinking took root. They had seen how quickly the disease spread along trade routes. They had learned that isolation, though temporary, could save lives. So they invested in maps, in safer ports, in relationships beyond borders. Trade would resume because it had to, but it would do so with a sharper awareness of risk. This was no renaissance, not yet, but it was movement. And that, in a Europe once frozen by fear, was everything. In the countryside, where the rhythms of life were slower but more deeply etched, the changes were just as real, though sometimes less visible. With entire villages depopulated, abandoned hamlets dotted the landscape. Forests reclaimed old fields. Birds nested in crumbling thatch. In some places, new tenants arrived: migrant workers, runaway serfs, second sons looking for fortune in land once claimed by the dead. Lords, desperate to restore productivity, offered incentives that would have been unthinkable before. Fixed rents replaced feudal duties. Long-term leases were granted. Some even promised freedom after a term of service. It was less generosity than necessity, but to the labourer, the difference mattered little. This rural shift had far-reaching effects. Peasants who once lived hand-to-mouth now negotiated. Markets emerged in places that had never seen coin. Families that once knew only debt and drought began to think of opportunity. A small class of yeoman farmers, independent, land-holding, ambitious began to form, and with them, a new kind of identity. Meanwhile, towns continued to recover, some flourishing faster than others. Where the ruling elite had perished, new men rose, guilds gained political sway, councils that had once been hereditary became elective. Power, always jealous of change, found itself increasingly shared. Architecture followed suit. New buildings rose, not always grand, but different. Wider streets, more light. Drainage systems, rudimentary but improving. Market halls and clock towers, symbols of civic pride and permanence. The medieval town, once chaotic and cramped, began its slow transformation into something closer to the early modern city. Even the arts responded. While death remained a dominant motif, new themes emerged too: labour, virtue, love, not idealized, but human. Religious imagery persisted, but increasingly bore the faces of real people: patrons, neighbours, children. Art was no longer only about heaven. It had begun to look at the earth. And in the background, quietly, the climate continued to cool. The little ice age would shape the next century, bringing shorter growing seasons, harsher winters, and new rounds of famine. But the memory of plague had taught Europe something crucial. Adaptability was survival. In fields and courts, in cathedrals and taverns, a new Europe was knitting itself together, not as it had been, but as it might be. In literature, the emotional weight of the Black Death lingered long after the final graves were sealed. Writers struggled not only to describe what had happened, but to make sense of it. Some turned to allegory, casting the plague as divine judgment, or the end of days. Others were more pragmatic, documenting its symptoms, its spread, and its aftermath with a coolness that would have seemed heartless in earlier times, but now passed for wisdom. The Decameron by Boccaccio stands as one of the most iconic responses. A group of young nobles flee plague-ridden Florence and tell each other stories to pass the time. These tales are humorous, tragic, erotic, moralistic, human. Beneath the stylized language is a deep truth that even amid catastrophe, people crave connection, narrative, and laughter. Elsewhere, chroniclers like Jean Froissart, Ibn Khaldun, and Matteo Villani recorded the facts of death with clarity and horror. They described not just the deaths themselves, but the disintegration of social order, the way law collapsed, the way families fell apart, the way the world seemed, for a time, to forget how to live. Yet memory did not fade. In fact, it hardened into culture. Throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, plague iconography proliferated. Murals of the Danse Macabre adorned churches, warning viewers that no one king or peasant escaped death's embrace. Timepieces bore skulls. Prayer books included miniatures of skeletal reapers. Death was not only inevitable, it was intimate. The fear of another outbreak remained constant. When plague returned, as it did sporadically for centuries, cities fell back on remembered practices: quarantine, isolation, burning of contaminated goods. Entire neighborhoods were walled off. Red crosses marked infected houses. Society lived with one eye always watching the door, waiting for the next shadow. This vigilance bred not only anxiety, but innovation. Port cities established boards of health, primitive public health departments to monitor ships, issue regulations, and even collect data. Medical theory remained flawed, but medical administration advanced. Cleanliness was encouraged. air was scented, burial became regulated. And through it all, the sense persisted that Europe had survived something monumental, something that had stripped away old certainties and forced new ones into being. Survival itself had become a form of resistance. Religious institutions, though shaken, did not collapse entirely. In fact, the church remained central to daily life, but its role was now contested in new ways. Many questioned its inability to explain or prevent the plague. The clergy's mass deaths, especially among frontline priests and monks, left spiritual vacuums in towns and villages. Untrained replacements were hurriedly ordained, leading to a decline in pastoral care and theological authority. In response, grassroots religious movements gained ground. The brethren of the common life in the Low Countries emphasized personal piety, humility, and education without monastic vows. Mystic voices like Julian of Norwich offered comfort not through dogma, but through deeply intimate visions of divine love. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. This new spirituality coexisted with deep institutional cynicism, corruption scandals in the papacy, rival claimants to the Holy See, and increasing reliance on indulgences eroded trust. The seeds of reformation were not yet sown, but the soil was being turned. In politics, too, transformation brewed. Monarchs who survived the plague found themselves ruling smaller, more fragile populations, but with fewer rivals and more concentrated power. The loss of so many nobles in some regions created sudden openings in courts and councils. Bureaucracies once stifled by tradition began to modernize. In England, the Statute of Labourers 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, a desperate attempt by the elite to hold back the tide of change. It failed. Revolts followed, most notably the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when thousands marched on London demanding fair treatment, reduced taxes, and an end to serfdom. Though violently suppressed, the message was clear: the old order was no longer unquestioned. In France, the 100 Years' War continued, but with new dynamics. A country already devastated by plague was further tested by military catastrophe. The interplay of war, disease, and labor shortage fractured the feudal structure and strengthened the crown in the long term. Trade routes, once arteries of contagion, became lifelines of revival. Cities like Venice and Genoa rebounded quickly, their merchants adapting to new realities with characteristic resilience. They invested in better ships, safer ports, tighter controls, and profits returned. With them came cultural exchanges, artistic revival, and eventually the glimmer of Renaissance. The world was not yet modern, but it was no longer medieval in the same way. It had remembered death. Now, it was learning to imagine something beyond it. The Black Death did not simply end. It receded. It flared again. It became part of Europe's rhythm, an unwelcome season that might return without warning. Every few decades, it did. A cough in spring, a swelling in summer, a death that looked too familiar. And yet, the world did not remain suspended in grief. As the 15th century dawned, Europe stirred with something unexpected curiosity, not just about theology or ritual, but about the world itself. Survivors, shaped by loss, began to ask deeper questions. What was life for? What could man know? What might lie beyond the known seas, the known scriptures, the known stars? The plague had shattered old maps of family, society, certainty. In its place, thinkers and dreamers began to redraw. In Florence, a banker's son named Cosimo de' Medici funded scholars, artists, and architects. Their work, inspired by ancient Greece and Rome, looked both backward and forward. The dome of the Florence Cathedral, the paintings of Masaccio, the humanist texts unearthed from monastic libraries, these were not mere decorations. They were declarations. Declarations that life was still worth living, that beauty still mattered, that man, made in the image of God, could think, create, and shape the world anew. This was not just a cultural flourish, it was a reaction, a deliberate, stubborn, glorious reaction to death. In classrooms from Padua to Paris, anatomy began to replace astrology. Dissection was still controversial, but it began. Astronomy drifted away from mysticism. Mathematics spread, aided by new scripts and, eventually, the printing press. And beneath the grandeur of Renaissance art and science, quieter changes hummed. The way people worked, the way they traded, the way they governed. The plague had broken so many bonds now, society was learning how to rebind itself differently. Women, in many households, had assumed new roles during the worst years. Some retained these responsibilities. In cities and estates where men had died, widows ran businesses, managed tenants, raised sons not only to inherit but to think. Peasants continued to migrate. Towns grew. Universities expanded. Cities no longer feared crowds the same way. They built over old plague pits. Life pressed onward, but they remembered. You'll still find them, those memories, in stone carvings above old doors, in folk songs passed down, in the narrow alleys of cities that once burned their dead by night. The Black Death ended lives, but it also, in a way no one could have predicted, began something. It began the modern age. Even the very structure of time began to shift. The old rhythms of saints' days and feudal obligations gave way to something newer: calendars, built around contracts, ledgers, and clocks. Merchants tracked inventories. Sailors timed tides. Cities began to measure themselves not only by piety, but by productivity. Printing, when it arrived in the mid-15th century, exploded the reach of knowledge. Books that once took years to copy could now be printed by the hundreds. Medical texts, religious debates, poetry, law words moved faster than ever before. The press would be called the engine of reform, and it was. But in its gears still clung the ash of plague fires and the silence of empty monasteries. Political structures, too, transformed. Kings and queens leaned on bureaucracy rather than noble kin. Centralized tax systems, standing armies, and increasingly literate advisors made governments stronger but also more complex. The fragility exposed by the plague had not vanished. It had adapted. In the countryside, land changed hands in waves. Formerly enslaved peasants became tenant farmers. Lords who had lost heirs sold estates. Agricultural practices shifted. Marginal land was abandoned. Forests regrew. The great open fields of pre-plague Europe shrank, replaced by enclosed pastures, private property, and rising tensions over land and labor. Religion did not vanish, but it changed. By the late 1400s, calls for reform rang louder. Men like Jan Hus in Bohemia, and later Martin Luther in Germany, questioned not just practices but principles. The plague had taught many that the church was not infallible, that suffering was not always punishment, that God, perhaps, was not so easily explained. These theological cracks widened into the Reformation and beyond. The scientific revolution, though a century away, grew from the same roots. Skepticism had been planted by trauma. The search for patterns, for predictability, for rules that governed a chaotic world. These were not just academic pursuits. They were survival strategies repurposed into discovery. Colonialism, too, found its footing in this post-plague world. With ports rebuilt, fleets expanded, and knowledge exchanged, European powers began to look outward not only for wealth but for escape, for new frontiers where plague, perhaps, could not follow. Yet the echoes of the Black Death never fully faded. Each generation remembered in its own way, some through prayer, some through law, some through art. Even today, historians and storytellers return to it not just for its drama, but for its mirror, to see how humanity behaves when faced with the unthinkable, to ask what breaks and what endures. Because the story of the Black Death is not just about dying. It is, against all odds, a story about living. Not everyone embraced change with open arms. In many corners of Europe, nostalgia clung tightly to old structures. Some communities doubled down on ritual, superstition, and inherited traditions. In rural parishes, sermons grew more fire and brimstone. Sin, suffering, and salvation were the only acceptable explanations. And for many, that was enough. Yet in towns, especially among merchants, artisans, and students, different winds blew. The universities, revived by wealthy patrons and increasingly secular interests, re-examined ancient texts with new eyes. Galen, Hippocrates, Aristotle were no longer read as unchallenged truth, but as foundations for debate. Inquiry took root, not in defiance of faith, but alongside it. Cultural memory embedded the trauma of the plague into architecture across Europe. Ossuaries rose chapels decorated with bones, altars made of skulls. In places like Kutna Hora or Sedlec, the dead were not hidden but displayed solemnly, reverently, and artistically. Memento mori became a genre, a reminder. Remember, you must die, but also remember you are alive. That contrast defined the post-plague generation. Art flourished not only as religious iconography, but as personal expression. Portraits appeared with greater realism. Landscapes captured not heavenly realms, but human ones, villages, rivers, trees, and toil. Language, too, democratized. Vernacular writing gained prestige. Chaucer wrote in English, Dante in Italian. Christine de Pizan, one of the earliest female professional writers, defended women and reason in eloquent French. These weren't just literary feats. They were declarations that truth and beauty could exist outside Latin, outside clergy, outside cathedrals. Families changed, with fewer children surviving. Investment in each child deepened. Inheritance structures shifted. Dowries became more strategic. Education, where available, was pursued more fiercely. This reshaped gender dynamics, labor expectations, and even the perception of childhood itself. Even leisure reflected new sensibilities. Festivals retained religious cores, but embraced theatre, satire, and spectacle. Guilds sponsored plays, towns held mock trials, symbolic executions, and pageants that both honored tradition and questioned it. Laughter, dark and knowing, threaded through the collective psyche. And with every passing decade, the spectre of plague grew more distant but never disappeared. It remained in habits, in policies, in the very layout of cities. New streets were wider, wells deeper. Quarantines became law. Lazaretto's plague hospitals were constructed near ports. Contagion had been named, if not fully understood, and infrastructure reflected that recognition. This new Europe, reborn through suffering, did not become utopia. It became something more complex, more conscious of its fragility, more adaptive, more questioning. The seeds of modernity, scientific, artistic, political, were scattered not in peace, but in the ashes of loss. Because where death walked, awareness followed, and with awareness came vision. This awareness extended beyond borders. Europe's neighbours had suffered too. Persia, the Levant, North Africa. The Black Death was not a European tragedy alone, though Europe often remembered it that way. Trade, always the bloodstream of the continent, carried plague across continents, and now it carried stories, remedies, and questions in return. Islamic physicians, already versed in quarantine and hygiene, recorded detailed observations of symptoms and transmission. In Cairo and Damascus, scholars debated causes with a sophistication absent in most European circles. These records, translated and shared, began to influence new generations of Western healers who no longer accepted rote doctrine. Travel changed too. Pilgrimage routes reopened, but with greater regulation. Ships were inspected. Ports established quarantine islands where travelers waited before disembarking. Traders had to carry proof of health, an early form of the modern health passport. Fear had become policy, yet commerce recovered with surprising speed, perhaps because it had to. Europe was a continent that could not feed or clothe itself alone. Spices from the east, furs from the north, silks from the Levant, gold and salt from Africa, all were too valuable to forsake. Within a generation, trade networks not only revived, but expanded, and this time, with better bookkeeping. The human toll, however, was permanent. Cemeteries remained fuller, genealogies had holes, churches bore plaques and faded names. Some villages never repopulated, others rebranded entirely. And across these landscapes, memory flickered, not always spoken, but ever present. That memory sometimes erupted into renewed violence. When later plagues returned in waves, 1361, 1474, 1390 and beyond, panic revived old scapegoats. Jews, foreigners, lepers, beggars. Fear knows old roads. And while institutions improved, human reaction remained painfully consistent. Still, there was resistance. Some towns protected their minorities. Some leaders refused to allow mob justice. Some clergy urged compassion over blame. And slowly, these responses gained moral ground. Suffering had not made everyone wiser, but it had made some brave. In this crucible, Europe hardened and softened in equal measure. It learned new forms of resilience, not the stoic endurance of the early Middle Ages, but something sharper, more strategic. Risk was calculated. Futures were imagined. The line between survival and ambition blurred. And in households where 3 generations once slept under one roof, a different rhythm began. Privacy, space, ownership. These ideas gained foothold. The home became not just shelter, but sanctuary. Families planted gardens, built fences, sewed initials into linens. The world outside remained uncertain. But the domestic realm became an anchor. These shifts reached even into spirituality. Mysticism grew. So did skepticism. Visionaries claimed new revelations. Reformers questioned indulgences. Hermits attracted pilgrims. Some saw apocalypse. Others, rebirth. And both were right, in their way. Because what followed the Black Death was not the end of medieval Europe. It was its metamorphosis. The metamorphosis was not loud. It did not announce itself in manifestos or monuments. It seeped into the bones of towns, the habits of households, the pages of parish records. A new Europe emerged tentative, uneven, but undeniably altered. Architecture began to reflect this shift. Stone buildings stood where timber had burned. Windows grew larger, streets straighter, plazas more open. Town planning, once ad hoc, now considered airflow, drainage, proximity. It wasn't science yet, but it was sense, honed by pain. In art, beauty turned inward. Religious icons gave way to portraits of merchants, mothers, and patrons. Landscapes crept into frescoes. The Madonna still reigned, but now she wept in streets familiar to the viewer. Christ was crucified under grey Tuscan skies. Heaven came closer, or perhaps earth reached upward. Language followed, bureaucracies grew, wills were written more carefully, ledgers expanded, commoners signed their names not always well, but with intention. The pen, once the tool of monks, spread to merchants, notaries, even soldiers. Paper replaced parchment, the written word, like disease before it, began to travel faster. This communication, in time, would fuel transformation. Within a century, printing presses would multiply books faster than any monk could dream. New ideas, scientific, theological, political, would challenge the old world. But none of that would have been possible without the rupture the plague carved across the continent. And so, even as the 1400s dawned with fresh wars, fresh dynasties, and fresh uncertainties, the memory of 1347-1351 lingered, not just as horror, but as hinge. Because in the end, the Black Death did not just end lives, it ended certainties. It shattered the illusion of unchanging order. And in that void, something new began, not yet renaissance, not yet reformation, but readiness. A readiness to question, to adapt, to imagine a world where change was not just possible, but inevitable. And tonight, as you close your eyes, perhaps you hear that echo, the quiet resilience of those who buried, wept, endured, and rebuilt, who faced the unimaginable and kept moving. Not heroes, not saints, just people. People who remind us, across centuries, that even in the darkest winters, spring waits. Good night. And what of the silence that followed? It wasn't always peaceful. Often, it was heavy. A silence interrupted by questions. Why had this happened? Could it happen again? Where was God? What had we done? The answers came slowly, and not always kindly. In some corners of Europe, people doubled down more ritual, more prayer, more suspicion. In others, they stepped back and began to think differently. The seeds of empiricism, of rationalism, of rebellion were watered with grief. Universities reopened and curricula changed. Astronomy gained ground against astrology. Observation began to rival scripture. Students still debated angels, but now also the structure of the human body, the properties of air, the function of blood. Slowly, fear began to give way to curiosity, and on the ground, practical changes reshaped the rhythm of daily life. Towns improved sanitation, not from love of science, but from hatred of death. Market inspections became stricter, burial protocols more orderly. Medical guilds rose in influence, even as their treatments lagged behind their ambition. The body politic, too, adjusted. Kings and princes who once ruled by sheer lineage found themselves needing justification, legal, economic, or spiritual. As the great landowners died without heirs, central powers moved in. Bureaucracies expanded, taxes became more regular, and, in time, more resented. This resentment did not always boil over. But when it did, whether in the form of urban uprisings, peasant revolts, or reformist sermons, it often traced its roots to the demographic and psychological shock of the plague. Even stories changed. The tales told to children, the epics sung in halls, the sermons preached on Sundays all shifted tone. Death had once been a mystery. Now, it was a neighbor. Saints became more human, sinners more understandable. And the line between the two, blurrier than ever. Yet, if the Black Death ended anything, it also began something else, the slow, painful birth of the modern self. Not the consumer, not the citizen, but the person who looks at the world not only as it is, but as it could be. That, perhaps, is the most enduring legacy. Not plague pits or tax codes, not grim paintings or hollowed villages, but perspective. Perspective became the quiet revolution. It whispered through the letters of survivors, scribbled in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, hinted at in wills and inventories. It crept into how people named their children less after saints, more after virtues, hope, mercy, fortune. It shaped the questions scholars dared ask, the satire poets dared write. The Black Death, for all its devastation, cracked the foundation of unquestioned tradition. For centuries, peasants had accepted that life was suffering, that hierarchy was sacred, that God's justice worked through kings and clergy. But now, that logic had faltered. Why had the righteous perished while the corrupt survived? Why had children died while murderers recovered? Such doubts didn't spark immediate revolution, but they seeded skepticism. And skepticism, carefully watered, grows into reform. Indeed, the distant tremors of what would become the Protestant Reformation, the scientific revolution, even Enlightenment thought, can be traced to the ground softened by plague. Luther's ancestors buried siblings in 1350. Bacon's forebears recorded crop failures and death tolls. Newton would later be born into a world still wary of contagion. But this is not a story about those later giants. It's about those who carried the grief, the silence, the slow reordering, the forgotten millions who mourned without monuments, who tilled the land while coughing, who whispered lullabies to half-empty cradles. They left few books, fewer names, but they left Europe changed. Even today, echoes remain. In public health, in the idea of quarantine, in the concept of sanitation, in the city plans that widened streets, drained swamps, demanded clean water, in the social contracts that began to value labor, negotiate worth, rethink charity, in literature that asks hard questions, in paintings that remember bone, in buildings that blend light with gravity, in the very notion that history can and should be learned from. So when you look at the world now, tilted as it sometimes feels, remember this. We have stood at the edge before. We have watched as everything known dissolved. We have mourned in silence, feared the breath of strangers, questioned the wisdom of those in power. And yet we endured, not because we were stronger, not because we were wiser, but because, when forced to choose between despair and motion, we moved. The Black Death was not the end of Europe. It was the pause before a new chord, a darker one. Yes, but richer. And in the centuries since, we still hear its note. Good night. Sleep well. And remember, we've been through worse. And still, in the quiet aftermath, came a subtler inheritance, one not etched in stone or measured in coin, but woven into the collective imagination of a continent. Europe began to tell new stories. Some were dark, laced with superstition and sorrow. Others were strangely brave. Speaking of rebirth and resilience, plays emerged where death was no longer an abstract force, but a speaking character dressed in bone, mocking kings and paupers alike. He walked among them, equalizing all. Mystery plays became more somber, morality tales more biting. The stage became a pulpit for secular warning as much as religious hope. In village squares and noble courts, actors portrayed not just saints and martyrs, but fools, merchants, widows, real people with real fears. Drama became not just entertainment, but therapy. Even lullabies changed. Where once they promised eternal peace, now they warned of wolves, of silence, of skies turning red. Parents, still aching from loss, held their children closer, but differently, with awareness, with an understanding that life was not promised, but borrowed. Burial customs adapted too. Where once ornate funerals had marked the wealthy, now there was simplicity, not out of humility, but necessity. And yet, in that necessity came a kind of shared humanity. The dead were remembered, not just by name, but by story. Anecdotes replaced headstones. Memories passed over bread, whispered beside fields, became the new record of a life lived. In monasteries, monks catalogued the dead with aching detail. Brother Thomas, strong voice, laughed at storms. Sister Agnes, who baked better than she prayed. They recorded not just loss, but personhood. And in these small acts of remembrance, something vital was preserved: the belief that even in disaster, the individual mattered. This shift from divine plan to human narrative laid the groundwork for the humanism to come, a belief that people were not just cogs in celestial wheels, but agents, authors, voices worth listening to, that the world, while frightening, was also knowable, shapeable. The medieval mind, once obsessed with the eternal, began to make space for the temporal, for life, in all its messy, painful, magnificent detail. And though plague would return in later waves, though Europe would still suffer wars, inquisitions, and schisms, the memory of those early years, the sudden black tide, and the stunned quiet after never truly left. It whispered through woodcuts. It lingered in libraries. It haunted thresholds where children once played. And it reminded every generation thereafter life is fragile. And that fragility makes it precious. And from the sorrow, art rose. The pain didn't disappear, it crystallized. It became frescoes of skeletons whispering to kings. Manuscript margins filled with grinning skulls. Music written in minor keys that ached with the sound of survival. Pain turned to pigment. Grief became inspiration. Churches, stripped of priests, were slowly refilled by new voices, some uncertain, some bold. A new kind of preacher emerged, not always sanctioned, not always orthodox, but always heard. These men, and occasionally women, spoke not just of salvation, but of justice, of mercy, of the living, and the people listened, because those left behind wanted more than ritual. They wanted meaning. Communities that had once simply endured now began to rebuild with intent. Some towns restructured entirely, adopting new charters, redistributing land, forming councils that gave more voice to merchants, to guilds, to those who had survived and worked to reclaim a place from absence. And in these gatherings of tailors and tanners, of millers and masons, a new kind of Europe was stitched together. One still scarred, still scared, but also, slowly, awake. Printing would come in time, so would reformation and exploration. But the echo of the plague was always there, a bass note under history's melody, a reminder that tomorrow was never guaranteed, and that from ash could rise not just memory, but momentum. The peasants who claimed land once tilled by dead lords' tenants, their children would march in revolts. The scribes who chronicled the horror with unflinching clarity, their students would question the cosmos. The widows who kept their households together through loss and famine. Their granddaughters would read, write, and one day argue theology. This is the legacy of the plague, not often told. Not just death, but decision. Not just suffering, but the strange, stubborn human urge to make meaning of it all. To grow something from ruin, to light a candle in the dark, even if it flickers. To begin again, centuries later, we still speak of the Black Death, not as a tale of despair, but as a pivot. A moment when the veil tore and the world glimpsed both its fragility and its resilience. Modern medicine was not born then, but its seeds were sown. Sanitation was no longer a luxury of the fastidious, but a demand of the collective. Hospitals shifted from places of exile to places of healing. The idea that the community bore responsibility for the health of all slowly took root. And those who lived through it, they carried more than scars. They carried perspective. They had seen death knock on every door, then pass. And they had kept living, planting, singing, questioning, loving. The legacy is not merely architectural or economic. It lives in us, in our reflex to shut borders during outbreaks, in our instinct to light candles for the lost, in our habit of measuring history by before and after. For what is history but memory writ large, and in the memory of the plague, we see a paradox. Death brought clarity, fear taught compassion, emptiness made space for new stories. Even now, echoes remain. In the tolling of a bell, in the hush of a crowded room when illness is named, in the art that won't look away, in the science that keeps asking why, and most of all, in us, the descendants not of kings or generals, but of survivors, people who grieved and kept going, who buried and rebuilt, who sang, even when it hurt. We do not remember the Black Death to indulge in tragedy. We remember it to honor the truth that even in the darkest chapters, humanity does not vanish. It changes. It endures. It learns. And so, when you next light a candle, close a book, or fall asleep listening to old stories, know this. You are part of a lineage of survivors. You are the continuation of a world once undone, and you, like them, carry forward the quiet, stubborn miracle of still being here. Good night. Sleep deeply. You are not alone. But even long after the graveyards grew mossy and the plague carts became folklore, the Black Death refused to be entirely silent. It lingered in laws rewritten in its wake, in cities restructured to breathe more freely, in the newfound bargaining power of workers. In the cracks it drove through the power of feudal lords, in the whispers that told children things have not always been this way, and they may not stay this way either. It's there in our stories of ghosts who wander fields, searching for families they never had time to say goodbye to. In village festivals, with wooden skeletons dancing in procession. In recipes passed down with superstitious instructions. Stir clockwise, never after dusk. No one remembers why, but they remember that they must. Even the language of mourning changed. Words became softer, more precise, less poetic, more personal. She passed in the night. He slipped away quietly. These are not euphemisms. They are echoes of a time when death was not a stranger, but a companion, and architecture bears witness. Wide streets designed not for beauty, but for breath. Plague columns in town. Squares, stone spires topped with saints. Silent thanks from cities that endured. And the empty chapels, quietly restored, but never quite refilled. The legacy of the Black Death is not only in what was lost, but in what was made necessary. Compassion, science, curiosity, adaptability, humility. We often credit the Renaissance with the rebirth of Europe, but it was the Black Death that cracked open the shell, that shook the bones, that made the question why as urgent as how, that whispered to philosophers, physicians, poets. Look deeper, ask again, don't forget. And so we remember not just the suffering, but the response, not just the despair, but the defiance, the candles lit, the songs written, the hands held through final breaths. Because if they could endure that silence and still make music, so can we. In university halls and candlelit studies, the world began to be redrawn, not just geographically, but intellectually. The plague had exposed the limits of old knowledge. Now, curiosity sharpened into inquiry. Physicians started recording symptoms, comparing cases, attempting haltingly to understand disease not as punishment, but as pattern. Medical texts began to reference observation over theory. Anatomy was taught not just from scrolls, but from dissection. Quietly, method crept into medicine, and in monasteries rebuilt from loss. Monks began preserving more than scripture. They recorded births and deaths with care. They noted floods and famines. They became reluctant historians, keepers of memory in a time when memory had nearly drowned. Trade, once tentative, resumed. But it wore a different face. Merchants kept better books. Ships were inspected more thoroughly. Ports erected customs offices and quarantine stations. The idea that a city might protect itself through organization took hold. People didn't forget. They adapted. The dance of death remained, painted in churches and scrawled in margins. But it no longer mocked it, warned, it reminded. It said death comes for all. So live wisely and live well. In family homes, stories became treasures. Grandparents passed down not just fables, but fragments of those years of carts full of bells, of candles in windows, of saints prayed to and silence endured. Children listened, wide-eyed, learning not just fear, but resilience. And as generations passed, something strange happened. The horror did not fade, but it was woven into identity, into caution, yes, but also into strength. Europe did not rise from the plague the same. It rose more curious, more skeptical, more driven to question. It did not trust blindly. It did not endure quietly. It pushed forward not despite the darkness, but because of it. And so the final gift of the Black Death, if it can be called a gift, is this: a reminder that nothing is permanent, that no order is immune to collapse, that every silence is pregnant with possibility, that after even the deepest night, someone always opens a window and breathes. In the centuries that followed, Europe would face wars, more plagues, revolutions, and renaissances. Yet the memory of the Black Death lingered like a watermark beneath the parchment of history. When new diseases appeared: smallpox, cholera, influenza, the responses, shaped by ancestral trauma, bore the fingerprints of the 14th century. Quarantine, sanitation, data, and above all, the instinct to protect the many by understanding the invisible. Even language changed. The words contagion, quarantine, pandemic. These were not born in 1347, but they came to life then. They became part of how humans spoke about fear, about survival, about each other. In art, death never truly left. It lurked in paintings, whispered in poems, the skeleton with the fiddle, the hourglass beside the saint. Even in celebration, there was a thread of mourning, a subtle nod to those who did not live to see the light return. And in our hearts, the echo remains. Every time we light a candle for someone lost, every time we cherish a touch, a laugh, a shared table, every time we wash our hands, or hesitate before a cough in a crowded room, we carry them, not as ghosts, but as memory, as guardians, as proof that even the worst night can be endured. And as you drift to sleep tonight, lulled by this old, difficult story, remember this: you are not merely a listener of history, you are its continuation. You are the breath after the silence, and your story, too, matters. Sleep well. And remember, the nightmare passed, but the dream remains. So we close the book, not with the end of a nightmare, but with the beginning of remembrance. The Black Death was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. It cracked open the walls of certainty and let doubt, learning, and resilience pour in. It took millions, but it also gave something back: a world that would never again be quite so unquestioning, so still. In its aftermath, Europe would rebuild not into what it was, but into what it could be. And it would do so carrying the invisible legacy of those who perished unnamed, whose stories now sleep beneath fields and cathedrals and city stones. Their silence shaped our sound, their stillness shaped our motion, their loss shaped our future. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and the story fades, may you rest knowing that even history's darkest chapters hold lessons, and that you are part of the story still being written. Good night. Sleep deeply, and dream, not of the plague, but of all that came after.